He'd shot down 32 American planes and told his squadron the F4U Corsair was a death trap with bad design. Then the Americans captured him, put him in a Corsair cockpit, and told him to take off. What he discovered in the next 20 minutes made him refuse to fly Japanese planes ever again. June 1945. Okinawa. A Japanese Navy pilot named Saburo Sakai has just been captured after his plane was shot down. He's one of Japan's top surviving aces with over 60 confirmed kills. For 3 years, he's been telling younger pilots that American aircraft are inferior, heavy, sluggish, no match for Japanese agility and pilot skill. But when American interrogators offer to let him fly a captured Corsair, everything he thought he knew about American aviation is about to get destroyed. This is the story of what Japanese pilots discovered about American planes that changed how they saw the entire war. Saburo Sakai was born in 1916 in a small farming village in Japan. His family was poor. His childhood was hard, but Sakai was ambitious and determined to escape poverty through military service. In 1933, at age 16, he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He didn't start as a pilot. He started as an ordinary seaman doing menial tasks on ships. But Sakai had a goal. He wanted to be a pilot. Naval aviation was prestigious and offered better pay and status than regular naval service. In 1937, Sakai applied for pilot training. The selection process was brutal. Thousands applied. Only a few dozen were accepted. Sakai made it through. He entered one of the most rigorous pilot training programs in the world. Japanese naval pilot training in the late 1930s was incredibly demanding. It lasted 3 years. Students flew multiple aircraft types. They practiced aerobatics, navigation, gunnery, and formation flying until they could do it perfectly. The washout rate was high. Many students failed or died in training accidents. Those who graduated were among the most skilled pilots in the world. Sakai graduated in 1939 and was assigned to fighters. He flew the A-5M, the predecessor to the famous Zero. When war with China expanded, Sakai saw his first combat. He flew missions over China, developing his skills against Chinese aircraft. By 1941, when Japan prepared for war with America and Britain, Sakai was an experienced combat pilot. When the Pacific War started in December 1941, Sakai was flying the new A-6M Zero fighter. The Zero was Japan's premier fighter aircraft. It was lightweight, highly maneuverable, and had exceptional range. In the early months of the war, the Zero dominated. Allied pilots who'd never faced it were shocked by its performance. The Zero could outturn anything the Allies flew. It could climb faster. It had better range. Japanese pilots like Sakai used these advantages to rack up impressive kill counts. Sakai participated in the attack on the Philippines. He flew cover for the invasion forces. He shot down his first American planes. He was part of the force that devastated Allied air power in Southeast Asia. Everywhere the Zero appeared, Allied aircraft fell from the sky. The Japanese pilots felt invincible. Their training was superior. Their aircraft were superior. The Allies couldn't match them. But Sakai and other experienced Japanese pilots started noticing things that worried them. American aircraft were tough. A Zero could outmaneuver an American fighter, but American planes could take enormous damage and keep flying. Zeros were fragile. A few bullets in the right place and the Zero would catch fire or fall apart. American planes like the Wildcat could absorb hundreds of rounds and still make it home. Japanese pilots initially dismissed this as a minor issue. Maneuverability mattered more than durability. If you could outturn the enemy, you'd shoot them down before they hit you. This logic worked early in the war when American pilots were inexperienced and tried to dogfight Zeros. But American pilots learned quickly not to dogfight. They developed tactics that used their aircraft's strengths and avoided the Zero's strengths. By 1943, Sakai was seeing new American aircraft that challenged Japanese dominance. The F4U Corsair, the F6F Hellcat, the P-38 Lightning. These aircraft were bigger and heavier than the Zero. They couldn't turn as tightly, but they were faster in level flight and in dive ease. They had more firepower, and they were much more durable. American tactics evolved to exploit these advantages. American pilots would dive on Zeros from above, make one firing pass, and zoom away before the Zeros could maneuver into position. If a Zero tried to follow, the American plane would outrun it. The Zero's superior maneuverability became irrelevant because American pilots refused to get into turning fights. Sakai found these tactics frustrating. American pilots were fighting smart instead of brave. They wouldn't engage in honorable dogfights. They'd hit and run like cowards. At least that's how Sakai described it. But he also recognized that the tactics were effective. Japanese losses were mounting. American losses were decreasing. Something was changing in the air war. In August 1942, Sakai was nearly killed in combat over Guadalcanal. He was hit in the head by a bullet that destroyed his right eye and paralyzed the left side of his body. He somehow flew his damaged Zero back to base, a distance of over 300 miles, while half-blind and partially paralyzed. It was a feat of incredible determination and skill. Sakai survived but spent months recovering. When he returned to combat, he flew with one eye and reduced peripheral vision. By 1944, Sakai was training new pilots. He'd teach them about American aircraft and tactics. He'd tell them that American planes were inferior in maneuverability, but dangerous because of their tactics and durability. He'd emphasize that Japanese pilot skill and the Zero's agility could still win fights if pilots were smart and avoided American strengths. But privately, Sakai was worried. The new pilots he was training weren't as skilled as the pre-war generation. Training had been shortened due to fuel shortages and urgency. New pilots had maybe 100 hours of flight time before being sent to combat. Sakai had over 800 hours before his first combat. These new pilots were being sent to die against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft in overwhelming numbers. Sakai also noticed that Japanese aircraft development wasn't keeping pace. The Zero was being upgraded incrementally, but the basic design was from 1940. American aircraft designs were newer and incorporated lessons learned in combat. The F4U Corsair, introduced in 1943, represented a generation leap. It was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything Japan was producing. Japanese pilots, including Sakai, maintained that the Zero's agility still made it the superior fighter. But this belief was increasingly detached from reality. By 1945, American pilots in Corsairs and Hellcats were dominating Japanese aircraft. The kill ratio had reversed completely. Early in the war, Japanese pilots shot down 5 Allied planes for every Japanese plane lost. By 1945, Americans were shooting down 10 Japanese planes for every American loss. Sakai knew the war was lost. He could see it in the numbers and in the decline of the Japanese Air Force. But he still believed in Japanese aircraft and pilot superiority on an individual level. He thought Japan was losing because of numbers and resources, not because American aircraft were better. This belief would be challenged when he became a prisoner. In June 1945, Sakai was flying combat missions from Kyushu, defending Japan's home islands against American air raids. These missions were desperate. American bombers came in waves with massive fighter escorts. Japanese fighters would attack and be overwhelmed by numbers. Losses were catastrophic. Most pilots didn't survive more than a few missions. On June 24th, Sakai's aircraft was hit by American fighters during a bomber interception mission. His engine was damaged. He couldn't maintain altitude. He had to ditch near Okinawa, which had been captured by American forces 2 months earlier. Sakai survived the ditching and made it to shore, but he was quickly captured by American Marines. Sakai expected execution. Japanese propaganda said Americans killed prisoners, especially pilots. Sakai had shot down many American aircraft. He thought the Americans would take revenge. Instead, he was given medical care, food, and was processed as a POW. The professional treatment surprised him. It contradicted everything he'd been told about American brutality. Sakai was taken to an interrogation center. American intelligence officers were very interested in him. He was a high-scoring ace with extensive combat experience. His insights into Japanese tactics and training would be valuable. But the interrogators were also curious about what Sakai thought of American aircraft. During interrogation sessions, the Americans would ask Sakai to assess American planes. What did he think of the Corsair, the Hellcat, the P-38? Sakai gave honest technical assessments. The Corsair was fast but heavy and sluggish in turns. The Hellcat was durable but not maneuverable. The P-38 was powerful but cumbersome. In his assessment, none matched the Zero's agility. The American interrogators listened politely. Then one asked Sakai if he'd ever actually flown an American aircraft. Sakai said no. He'd only fought against them. The interrogator asked if Sakai would like to fly a Corsair, to see for himself what it was like. Sakai thought this was a trick. Why would Americans let an enemy pilot fly their aircraft? But the offer was genuine. The Americans had been having Japanese POW pilots fly captured Japanese aircraft to evaluate their characteristics. They thought it would be interesting to reverse the experiment. Let a Japanese pilot fly an American plane and get his professional assessment. It would provide insight into how Japanese pilots understood their equipment and whether their understanding was accurate. Sakai was curious despite his suspicions. He agreed. A few days later, he was taken to an airfield where several American aircraft were parked, including an F4U Corsair. American pilots and mechanics walked him through the aircraft, showed him the controls, explained the systems. The Corsair was completely different from anything Sakai had flown. First impression, the Corsair was huge, much larger than a Zero, heavier. The engine was enormous, a massive 2,000 horsepower radial. The Zero's engine was 1,100 horsepower. The Corsair's cockpit was cramped despite the plane's size. Visibility was poor compared to the Zero's bubble canopy. The instrument panel was covered with gauges and switches. Complexity everywhere. Sakai sat in the cockpit and familiarized himself with the controls. Stick, rudder pedals, throttle. Similar layout to Japanese aircraft, but everything felt heavier. The flight controls weren't directly connected like in a Zero. They went through systems that Sakai didn't fully understand. He was nervous. This plane was unfamiliar and supposedly difficult to fly. Corsairs had a reputation among American pilots for being unforgiving of mistakes. An American pilot talked Sakai through the startup procedure. The engine roared to life with a sound unlike anything in a Japanese aircraft. Deep, powerful. The whole plane vibrated. Sakai taxied the Corsair to the runway with an American pilot in a jeep following to provide radio guidance. Taxiing was difficult. The Corsair's nose was so long that Sakai couldn't see directly ahead while on the ground. He had to S-turn while taxiing to see where he was going. At the runway, Sakai ran through the pre-takeoff checks with American guidance over the radio. Then he was cleared for takeoff. He pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was shocking. The Corsair leaped forward. The power was overwhelming. The engine roar was deafening. The plane accelerated faster than any Japanese aircraft Sakai had flown. The tail came up. The runway blurred. And then Sakai pulled back on the stick and the Corsair climbed into the sky. The climb rate was incredible. The Corsair shot upward like it was launched from a catapult. Sakai had never experienced climb performance like this. The Zero could climb well, but this was different. Raw power forcing the plane upward. Within seconds, Sakai was at 1,000 feet. He leveled off and started to get a feel for the aircraft. His first maneuvers were gentle, small turns, trying to understand how the Corsair responded. The control forces were heavy. The plane didn't respond instantly like a Zero. There was a delay, a sense of momentum. The Corsair was big and heavy and it flew like it. But as Sakai gained confidence and tried more aggressive maneuvers, he started understanding what the plane could do. The Corsair was fast, incredibly fast. Sakai pushed the throttle forward and the plane accelerated in level flight to speeds the Zero could never reach. He tried a dive. The acceleration was phenomenal. The Corsair built up speed faster than Sakai expected. He pulled out of the dive and the plane held together without any stress. A Zero would have been shaking and on the edge of structural failure. The Corsair felt solid. Sakai tried turns. The Corsair couldn't turn as tightly as a Zero, but it could turn. And while turning, it didn't bleed energy the way Sakai expected. The powerful engine maintained speed even in hard turns. The Corsair might take longer to complete a turn than a Zero, but it would come out of the turn going faster than the Zero. This was a different type of maneuverability. He tried aerobatics, rolls, loops. The Corsair performed them smoothly. Everything felt controlled and powerful. There was no sense that the plane was at its limits. A Zero at high speed felt fragile, like it might come apart if you pushed too hard. The Corsair felt like you could push it as hard as you wanted and it would take it. Sakai spent 20 minutes flying the Corsair through various maneuvers, testing its characteristics, understanding its strengths and weaknesses. By the time he lined up for landing, his understanding of American aircraft had completely changed. This wasn't an inferior plane flown by superior numbers. This was a fundamentally different design philosophy that had advantages Sakai hadn't appreciated. The landing was tricky. The Corsair's poor forward visibility made judging the approach difficult. Sakai came in too fast the first time and had to wave off. The second approach was better. He got the plane on the ground. Hard landing but acceptable. He taxied back to the parking area where American personnel were waiting. When Sakai shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, the American interrogator who'd arranged the flight asked what he thought. Sakai's response was blunt. He said the Corsair was a better aircraft than he'd believed, that he'd misunderstood what American aircraft were designed to do, that Japanese pilots, including him, had been wrong about American aircraft inferiority. Over the following days, American interrogators had long conversations with Sakai about his flight experience and his revised understanding of American aircraft. Sakai explained that Japanese pilots, himself included, had been evaluating American aircraft using Japanese criteria: maneuverability, agility, lightness. By these criteria, American aircraft were inferior, but American aircraft weren't designed to those criteria. They were designed for different priorities. American aircraft prioritized durability, firepower, and pilot survivability. The Corsair was built like a tank. It could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. The pilot sat behind armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. If the Corsair was hit, the pilot had a good chance of surviving. If a Zero was hit, it often caught fire or exploded. American aircraft also prioritized maintainability. The Corsair could be serviced by mechanics with basic training. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. A damaged Corsair could be repaired quickly and returned to service. Zeros were maintenance-intensive and required skilled mechanics. In extended campaigns, American aircraft maintained high readiness rates while Japanese aircraft readiness declined. The speed and climb rate advantages Sakai experienced in the Corsair were deliberate design choices. American designers knew their pilots couldn't outturn Japanese fighters, so they designed aircraft that could dictate the terms of engagement through speed. American pilots could attack when they wanted and disengage when they wanted. Japanese pilots couldn't force American aircraft into turning fights. Sakai also came to understand American pilot training differently. He thought American pilots were less skilled because they avoided dogfights. But avoiding dogfights wasn't cowardice. It was smart tactics. American training taught pilots to use their aircraft's strengths: speed, firepower, durability. American pilots who followed their training survived and became experienced. Japanese pilots who flew aggressive turning fights often died young no matter how skilled they were. The American interrogators showed Sakai production figures. America was producing thousands of aircraft per month. Japan was producing hundreds. Sakai had known American production was higher, but seeing the actual numbers was shocking. The numerical disparity explained why Japanese pilots felt constantly outnumbered. They were outnumbered by ratios that made victory impossible. But the production numbers also highlighted another advantage. America could afford to use aircraft until they were worn out and then replace them. Japan had to keep repairing and flying aircraft that should have been retired. American pilots flew relatively new aircraft with low hours. Japanese pilots flew old aircraft with high hours that were increasingly unreliable. Sakai learned about American aircraft development programs. New designs were constantly being tested. Improvements were incorporated continuously. The Corsair that Sakai flew was already being supplanted by newer variants with better engines and systems. Meanwhile, Japan was still flying Zeros based on a 1940 design, because developing and producing new designs required resources Japan didn't have. The interrogators asked Sakai if he wanted to fly other American aircraft. He did. Over the next weeks, Sakai flew a Hellcat, a Wildcat, and a P-51 Mustang. Each aircraft reinforced his revised understanding. American aircraft were optimized for different priorities than Japanese aircraft. Neither approach was inherently superior in abstract terms, but in the context of a long attrition war between industrial powers, the American approach was devastatingly effective. The P-51 particularly impressed Sakai. The combination of speed, range, and altitude performance was remarkable. The P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Japan and still have fuel to fight Japanese interceptors. No Japanese fighter could match this range. The P-51 could also outperform Japanese fighters at high altitude. As American B-29 bombers bombed Japan from above 30,000 feet, Japanese fighters struggled to intercept at those altitudes, while P-51s operated comfortably. Sakai told the interrogators that if he'd understood American aircraft capabilities earlier, he would have trained Japanese pilots differently. He would have emphasized the dangers of American speed and firepower, rather than dismissing American aircraft as inferior. He would have taught defensive tactics to survive against aircraft that could dictate engagement terms. He would have been more realistic about Japanese disadvantages, rather than relying on assumptions about Japanese superiority. But Sakai also acknowledged that better tactics wouldn't have changed the war's outcome. Japan was simply outproduced. Even if every Japanese pilot had perfect understanding of American capabilities, Japan couldn't build enough aircraft to compete. The industrial gap was too large. American advantages in resources, production capacity, and logistics were decisive regardless of tactical details. The interrogators asked Sakai if he would write a report about his observations for potential use in intelligence work or propaganda. Sakai agreed. He spent days writing a detailed technical assessment of American aircraft from a Japanese pilot's perspective. He was honest about their strengths and about how Japanese pilots had misunderstood them. He explained how Japanese training and doctrine had been based partly on false assumptions about American inferiority. Sakai's report was distributed within American intelligence circles and was considered valuable. It provided confirmation that Japanese pilots really didn't understand American aircraft design philosophy, that Japanese overconfidence was based partly on fighting American pilots who were initially inexperienced and tactically naive. Once American pilots learned how to use their aircraft properly, Japanese advantages evaporated. But Japanese pilots continued believing they had superior aircraft long after the evidence showed otherwise. Saburo Sakai's transformation from confident advocate of Japanese aircraft superiority to someone who understood why American aircraft were actually more effective reveals important truths about World War II air warfare. Japanese aircraft like the Zero weren't bad designs. They were optimized for specific priorities that made sense for Japan's pre-war situation: lightweight, long-range, highly maneuverable. These characteristics allowed Japan to project air power across vast distances in the Pacific with limited resources. But these design priorities came with trade-offs. The Zero sacrificed durability for lightness. It sacrificed pilot protection for performance. It sacrificed maintainability for tight tolerances and maximum efficiency. These trade-offs worked fine when Japan was fighting short campaigns against less capable opponents. They became fatal in a long war against an opponent with superior resources. American aircraft designers made different trade-offs. They accepted less maneuverability in exchange for durability. They accepted more weight in exchange for pilot protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. They accepted slightly less elegant performance in exchange for ease of production and maintenance. These trade-offs made American aircraft less impressive in individual performance metrics, but more effective in sustained combat operations. The different design philosophies reflected different strategic situations. Japan was a resource-poor island nation that needed to win wars quickly through superior skill and technology. American was a resource-rich continental power that could win through attrition and overwhelming production. Both nations designed aircraft that matched their strategic needs. But when the war became a long attrition fight, American design philosophy proved superior. Sakai's experience flying the Corsair revealed something important about evaluation bias. Japanese pilots evaluated American aircraft using Japanese criteria and concluded American planes were inferior. But the criteria were wrong. American aircraft weren't trying to be better than Japanese aircraft at dogfighting. They were designed for a different type of warfare. Once Sakai actually flew a Corsair and understood what it was designed to do, he recognized its strengths. This evaluation bias affected Japanese training and tactics. Japanese pilots were taught that their aircraft were superior and that American aircraft were inferior. This gave Japanese pilots confidence, but also made them underestimate their opponents. When American pilots used tactics that exploited their aircraft's actual advantages, Japanese pilots were often surprised and defeated. Better understanding of American capabilities wouldn't have let Japan win, but it might have reduced Japanese pilot losses. The pilot protection differences between Japanese and American aircraft had long-term consequences. American pilots who were shot down or had to bail out often survived and returned to combat. Japanese pilots in similar situations usually died because Zeros lacked armor and self-sealing tanks. Over time, American pilot experience levels increased while Japanese pilot experience levels decreased. By 1945, average American pilots were better trained and more experienced than average Japanese pilots, revering the situation from 1942. Sakai's assessment that the war was lost due to production rather than aircraft quality was accurate. Japan couldn't compete with American industrial capacity. Even if Japanese aircraft had been clearly superior in all performance metrics, America could have overcome this through numerical superiority. But Japanese aircraft weren't clearly superior. They had specific advantages that became less relevant as American tactics evolved. And they had serious disadvantages in durability and pilot protection that accumulated over time. The story of Japanese pilots discovering that American aircraft were more capable than they'd believed connects to broader themes about overconfidence and misunderstanding opponents. Japan entered the war confident that superior fighting spirit and better training would overcome American material advantages. This confidence was based partly on racism and cultural prejudice. Japanese military culture taught that Western nations were soft and decadent. Real combat experience showed this was false, but the ideology persisted. Sakai was unusual among Japanese pilots in his willingness to revise his understanding when confronted with evidence. Many Japanese pilots, even after experiencing American capabilities firsthand, clung to beliefs about Japanese superiority. They attributed defeats to bad luck, numerical disadvantages, or specific tactical errors, rather than acknowledging systematic problems with Japanese aircraft and doctrine. This inability to learn from experience was a significant Japanese weakness throughout the war. After the war ended in August 1945, Sakai was repatriated to Japan. He found a country destroyed by bombing and facing occupation. The proud nation that had sought to dominate Asia was defeated and humiliated. Sakai's experiences as a POW had prepared him for this reality better than most. He understood that Japan had been overmatched, that the war had been unwinnable, that continuing to fight had just increased the destruction. Sakai wrote a memoir about his war experiences that was published in 1957 and became a bestseller in Japan and internationally. In the book, he was honest about his evolution in understanding American capabilities. He described his initial dismissiveness of American aircraft and how his experience flying the Corsair changed his view. He acknowledged that Japanese pilots, including him, had been wrong about many things. Sakai lived until 2000, dying at age 84. In his later years, he spoke frequently about the war and its lessons. He emphasized that technological overconfidence was dangerous, that understanding your opponent's actual capabilities rather than what you want to believe about them is essential, that assuming superiority based on ideology rather than evidence leads to disaster. These lessons came directly from his experience, discovering that American aircraft were far more capable than he'd been taught to believe. The Japanese pilots of World War II were skilled and brave. The aircraft they flew were well designed for specific purposes. But skill and bravery couldn't overcome systematic disadvantages in aircraft design philosophy, industrial production, and strategic resources. Sakai learned this lesson by flying a Corsair for 20 minutes and discovering that his understanding of American aircraft had been fundamentally wrong. That revelation, coming from one of Japan's best pilots, illustrates how badly Japanese military leadership misunderstood the opponent they were fighting. Watch the next video for another story about what Japanese soldiers discovered too late.